community. So regionalism is not something new. In 1980s, there was an explosion of such regional program on a global scale. For example, we know the European Union, we know the African Union, ASEAN, UNASUR, and so on and so on. So the peak of the ASEAN regionalism came up with the establishment of what's so-called ASEAN community. In 2015, let's move to the next slide. Everyone is familiar with the idea that is the ASEAN community. The ASEAN community consists of not only economic community where good services and people can move freely from one place to another in Southeast Asia, but also it include also political security community as well as socio-cultural community. So assuming that the ASEAN community works, the regionalism as a political project has been successful, then we can assume that Southeast Asia should have a collective response to many issues, including issues that we are currently facing. That is the threat of the question is, does it really happen that we have reached a stage in which ASEAN become a community? Regionalism is working in Southeast Asia. Now, let us check with what happened. Next slide, please. Coronavirus is not the first challenge to Southeast Asia. It is not the first threat to Southeast Asia. Early 2000, that was in 2003, Southeast Asia faced also serious problem with the SARS. And during this outbreak of SARS, ASEAN leaders fought to build up national capabilities as well as regional coordination to respond rapidly and effectively to future pandemics. So there was a kind of consciousness among the political leaders that the pandemic diseases like the SARS could happen again in Southeast Asia, and therefore ASEAN should build a form of response. So in that way, we are talking about regionalism. So regionalism as a means to respond the threat to Southeast Asia. And again, between 2003, 2005, we were faced with another pandemic disease, that is H5N1, as well as H1N1, avian influenza. And again, the response of the ASEAN leaders has been very, very promising. They promised to reinforce preparedness to combat pandemic, and this preparedness and response has been high on the agenda at the national level as well as at the regional level. The Southeast Asian nations have collectively produced what's so-called ASEAN preparedness and response to the pandemic diseases. So we hope that this has been a solid foundation on how Southeast Asia responds to such diseases. And now, what happened with the coronavirus? When the coronavirus threat us with the fatalities, which is currently very much on the rise. Let's look at the current update on the ASEAN and COVID-19. Next slide, please. Initially, the countries in Southeast Asia didn't have any idea that this kind of virus can be very threatening to Southeast Asian countries. And even many leaders, including the ASEAN, the leaders in Indonesia, believe that no, coronavirus will not affect us because we are in the tropical area, which make it impossible for the coronavirus to attack us. But it has been proven to be wrong. And in fact, now the victim is on the rise, and many experts are afraid of the fact that Indonesia is getting more and more on the way as the hotspot or epicentrum of the coronavirus in Southeast Asia. We have several mechanisms. Next slide, please. We have actually a collective mechanism. See, we have what's so-called ASEAN mechanism to respond to COVID-19 outbreaks. So when we are talking about regionalism, this should be the product of regionalism. The regionalism should guide us with the policy recommendation, policy action in which we can collectively and concretely deal with the challenge of the coronavirus. But again, I would say that this is unfortunately still very much a kind of utopia. Despite the rhetoric of the ASEAN mechanism to respond COVID-19 outbreak, Southeast Asian countries did not have concrete and common strategy against this coronavirus. Next slide, please. We found that there is a diversity of the national responses to the threat of the coronavirus. Singapore and Vietnam become a global model for early action and aggressive containment of the coronavirus. Other countries like Indonesia, Thailand, the Philippines, and Malaysia have been far less coherent in their policies and less organized in their approach to combat the coronavirus. And of course, don't talk about the poorest countries in Southeast Asia, Myanmar and Laos. They didn't have even a policy or approach to deal with the virus. Okay, let me go through this diversity of national responses to the threat of coronavirus country by country. Let's go first of all to Singapore. Sorry, I have to look at my notes because I cannot make a slide for that because it has been too long if I do it. So the two first countries which has become the model because of their early action and aggressive containment in Southeast Asia are Singapore and Vietnam. What did Vietnam and Singapore do for combating the coronavirus? Singapore is, of course, the first to respond to the coronavirus. As soon as the coronavirus was detected in China in late January, the Singaporean government banned travelers from China immediately. And then also the government of Singapore launched massive screening of individuals as well as provide free testing for potential cases and many other measures. The Singaporean government also decided to guarantee all those who travel from abroad, as well as those who had contact with people confirmed as the coronavirus infected persons. So those clear action by the government create a lot of security among the people there. And therefore, Singapore has been very much cited as the example of the swift action against this coronavirus. And then Vietnam, it's quite surprising. Vietnam, as soon as the coronavirus was detected in China, then stopped the flight from China. Vietnam also closed the school nationwide. And also, Vietnamese government began to apply the lockdown in the part of the province of Hanoi as soon as they realized that some workers from Wuhan came back to Vietnam. So they realized of what should be done in dealing with this issue. And also, the Vietnam government banned businesses, uh, large gathering, school, and so on, as well as the Vietnamese government provide aggressive containment as well as information to the public to educate public about the threat of this coronavirus. So the two governments have done quite well in dealing with the issue, regardless of ASEAN's mechanism to respond COVID-19. Now let's move to Malaysia. In the early of even I think uh, after the coronavirus has been detected, Malaysian government allow a very big religious gathering in a mosque in the near of Kuala Lumpur. 16,000 people were there, although they around. And as a matter of fact, among those who attended this big gathering were to spread the virus in countries like Indonesia, Brunei. Only in March, this government started to coronavirus by making making lockdown and so on, closing school, shop, public offices, and places of worship. So initially, the Malaysian government didn't take a serious actions against this challenge, the threat of coronavirus. But as soon as they realized the severity of the threat, they began to do a very serious uh, job. In Brunei, it is a very small and very easy to manage. They did a very good job suddenly, and nothing special about Brunei. But in Indonesia, as we know it, it's quite interesting case. Of course, we face a serious problem with the public facilities, health facilities. But the more important problem with Indonesia is that the government's directive are very, very confusing. There are so many different messages sent by the government and the government official, which make people getting confused. For example, just a couple of days ago, the Ministry of Health had a policy to not to allow a motorcycle to be used to transport persons. But now the interim Minister of Transportation, Luhut Bin Sarpanjaitan, allow this to happen. And then Jokowi, on the one hand, he said that people should not go back for mudik during the Lebaran, but at the same time, he also said that we cannot forbid them to go back home during the end of Ramadan. So there are a confusing message with the Indonesian case. Therefore, many experts are worrying about the situation in Indonesia. The Philippines is even worse. The government initially simply downplayed the seriousness of the issue. The government didn't take any action until March 2020, in which the government shifted the action very severely by making a very, very tough action. But it has been too late, and it has violated so many rights of the people. Thailand has also been very late in responding uh, the threat, but later it has make a good policy to limit the spread of the coronavirus. And once again, the two poor countries, Cambodia and Myanmar, didn't have any policy, didn't have any approach, and even reported there was no cases of infectious diseases in Myanmar and Laos. And finally, it was detected that there was also cases found in Myanmar and Laos. So the diversity with the ASEAN countries responded to the threat of virus simply didn't reflect any collective mechanism that they have agreed upon following the threat of SARS in 2003. So it seems that the coronavirus virus is something that is new and create a panic in Southeast Asia as if we didn't have any preparation at all. Although institutionally we have so many mechanisms, so many meetings about pandemic diseases and so on in Southeast Asia, but it is simply not reflected in the way in which ASEAN is responding to the crisis. Could you move to the next slide, please? Now, I would like to try to find out the explanation of these differences. Why such a collective and coherent policies at the regional level didn't exist? Why ASEAN regionalism, which we are very proud of, especially in 2015 with the adoption of ASEAN community, simply didn't exist when we need it at most? There are three possible explanations for that. The first possible explanation is the performance and the legitimacy of the government. We can see from the responses of the different countries in Southeast Asia, reflecting the responses of the government with a good governance to the government with very authoritarian in nature, which are struggling for power, which try to make use even the coronavirus to strengthen their strongholds of power. So the characteristic of the political system in Southeast Asia simply reflected in the way in which they respond to the virus challenge. Of course, I cannot say that democratic countries respond better than authoritarian countries. No, but the better the governance, the better the response to the coronavirus. It can be authoritarian, it can be democratic. The case of the Philippines and Indonesia, both are democratic, but people are doubtful that these two countries are effective in dealing with this case. And then the second possible explanation is the dynamics of bilateral, regional, and global cooperation. That is quite different, reflected in the response of the Southeast Asian countries. Indonesia, for example, while domestically we have so many problems in dealing with the coronavirus, but we are very active at the international level. We, along with other countries, try to push UN resolutions about this. Probably this is reflecting the role of Indonesia as an emerging power. Indonesia is one of the non-permanent member of the Security Council. Indonesia is the only country at the G20, and we have to live up to the role that we have at the international level. But it is not supported by the coherent policy at the domestic level. Singapore, a small and tiny country with a good government, effective bureaucracy, they try to respond to coronavirus by, providing assistance to the poorer country in Southeast Asia, sending medical equipment, medicine to the mainland countries in South. And also, the final explanation, probably the external power influence. the relationship between Vietnam and China probably explain why Vietnam responded very quickly to the virus coming from China. Cambodia, on the other hand, for example, simply didn't think that the coronavirus from China as threatening, as life-threatening. Hun Sen, despite the threat of the coronavirus, visited Beijing, and even Hun Sen welcomed the tourists of the luxury ships docked in Phnom Penh, and even personally greeted them and give them bonus to sightseeing in the city. Although this ship has been rejected in many countries from landing. So it is quite interesting to see the combination of the action of the leaders in Southeast Asia, which one thing is very clear, that all those action, different responses to the coronavirus threat simply does not reflect that ASEAN exists. That ASEAN as regionalism project exists in the policy of the individual countries. So having said that, I would like to conclude my presentation by saying once again that even at the head of our optimism with ASEAN community, the fact is that ASEAN community doesn't seem to exist if we look at from the way in which the ASEAN member countries reflect to respond to the coronavirus crisis. And the second one, I don't go further into this. Even if we look at the component of ASEAN community, that is socio-cultural community, in which the ASEAN leaders would like to make ASEAN as the project of the people in Southeast Asia, it does not exist either. Simply because, for example, when the Malaysia government, for example, applied the lockdown, what they were doing was to treat their own citizens, but not the citizen of others. The character of the threat of the coronavirus cannot be contained simply by nationality. It is by human being. It is humanity. It is the threat of humanity. It cannot be responded if we always think in terms of in group and out group, like Bu Devi mentioned. And also I appreciate very much the way in which the Taiwanese government tried to give attention to the minority by providing information that they have. Even this does not happen in ASEAN countries. In Singapore, even when the Singaporean government, which I mentioned before, has a very tough action against coronavirus, the government also left part of the people in Singapore, living in Singapore, that is the migrant worker, vulnerable to this coronavirus. When they live in a very crowded area as a worker, in the construction worker, and so on and so on, simply because they are not Singaporean citizen and they are not eligible for medical services enjoyed by the Singaporean. And this is also the case in Southeast Asia, in other countries in Southeast Asia as well. So hopefully, coronavirus threat teach us another lesson for the ASEAN leaders to be more seriously to think about ASEAN mechanisms to respond pandemic diseases. We have already learned from 2003, 2005, with the threat of the SARS, with the threat of avian flu, but this should be basis for the action for the coronavirus as well. But unfortunately, this is not to be seen up to now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Pak Muhadi, for taking our attention and concern and how ASEAN, the Southeast Asian Asian Nations Association, the Association of Southeast Asian Nation dealing with this crisis, and also as well on how diverse in its member countries deal with this coronavirus spread. All right. I think I would like to continue. We will continue to the second session, and I would like to invite um, participants to questions. The first one will be Joko Pitoyo. Mbak Santi, please. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you very much, Pak Japti. All right.
I'm so sorry because I will speak in Bahasa. It's no problem.
No problem at all, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Actually, I would like to confirm to Devi, as Bu Devi mentioned that in group and out group, membedakan antara penduduk asli dengan penduduk pendatang. Mohon maaf sebelumnya ya. Jadi apa yang disampaikan oleh Bu Dewi barangkali itu adalah kasus ya. Saya tidak akan mengatakan bahwa itu artinya mungkin itu terjadi, tetapi sebetulnya saya juga melakukan beberapa kajian, walaupun tidak banyak, bagaimana antara penduduk asli dengan penduduk pendatang itu di dalam merespon terhadap COVID-19. Justru ini mohon maaf, ini juga di tempat saya ya, justru kebersamaan antara penduduk asli dengan penduduk pendatang itu sangat luar biasa. Kenapa bisa begitu? Itu karena komunikasi yang bagus sejak awal antara penduduk asli dan penduduk pendatang. Dan kami ada kelompok gitu ya, ada grup yang secara bersama-sama sejak awal itu sudah get together untuk bersama-sama menghadapi virus ini. Artinya begini, dikotomi antara penduduk asli dengan penduduk pendatang itu justru memperkeruh, memperpanjang, memperlebar masalah bagaimana penanganan terhadap coronavirus. Walaupun jelas itu di lapangan akan terjadi. Tetapi ini perspektif saya ya, bahwa komunikasi, bagaimana kita berkomunikasi dengan mereka itu menjadi sangat penting. Saya menyadari sepenuhnya bahwa penduduk asli itu memiliki dia ingin menunjukkan eksistensinya, bahwa dialah yang memiliki tumpah darah, bahwa dialah yang memiliki dia sebagai pewaris dari wilayah itu, sehingga ini barangkali yang kemudian menjadikan dia terlalu sensitif ketika kemudian ada berbagai hal, mulai ada ketidaksesuaian dan sebagainya ketika di lapangan, mungkin gesekan-gesekan pada saat diskusi dan sebagainya. Mohon maaf, ini sekedar perspektif saya hanya mohon respon dari Bu Dewi, bagaimana sebaiknya untuk mengintegrasikan antara penduduk asli dengan pendatang terkait dengan COVID-19 ini. Terima kasih.
Pertanyaannya, maybe I could translate a little bit to Prof. Deng. So Pak Joko Pitoyo questioned Bu Dewi about the fact that there is no conflict, in fact, in his village community. So the outsider and insider work together in dealing with this corona outbreak. And he questions on how to better organize this out-group and in-group relations. The time is yours, Bu Dewi. You can either answer in Indonesian or in Bahasa Indonesia.
I think Pak Joko is right when I read the written question from Pak Joko in the chat room, and I think it's important to highlight that perhaps the relations between the pendatang and penduduk asli vary from place to place. There is a book. It's an old book in 1995 written. One of the authors is Professor Ida Bagus Mantra, and Professor Ida Bagus Mantra is used to work for our center. So basically, I would say that the relations between pendatang and penduduk asli cannot be separated from the context, from the social or historical context of, the first time when the people who are outside from the village started to move to the village. So this particular book, I was trying to look for the title of the book, but I was not able to find it. But anyway, the book differentiates between several cases, several villages, and the argument that is made by the book is that the relationship between the pendatang and penduduk asli may not be cohesive because the people, particularly the people who live in the villages that are located near ring road, the pendatang were able to get more benefit from the structure of opportunity compared to the people who are penduduk asli. And this historical context become the seat of the corrosiveness of the society. In other words, there is a division, social division between pendatang and penduduk asli since the 90s because of this different access to structure of opportunities and the divisiveness of that was brought by the historical context can be felt up to now. Whereas in other places in Yogyakarta, it's possible, like, for example, the case or the cases that Pak Joko mentioned, it's very possible to have a village that has cohesive relationship between the pendatang and penduduk asli because the penduduk asli did not, or the pendatang and the penduduk asli did not have to go through the competition of job opportunities or other opportunities. And I think the problem is not so much as whether the sociological problem is to how to shift the relationship that is corrosive, that is defined by divisiveness into the one that is more cohesive. And I think this needs time to do it. And like I said earlier, Pak Joko also agreed with me that there are differences in asset, and that the pendatang are mostly have more education, they are more educated, they have better job, they have better livelihood. And indeed, I agree when Pak Joko said that the penduduk asli juga ingin menunjukkan eksistensinya, so but in cases where the relations between penduduk asli dan pendatang, it's kind of complicated. In some places there is no healthy communication because the pendatang, I've seen that sometimes the pendatang decided not to say anything. They left everything to the penduduk asli because from the perspective of pendatang, they are also afraid that people will look at them as keminter, sok tahu, sok pinter sendiri. So I think the building good relationship is something that has to be done prior to COVID. And now with a lot of people who live in a corrosive community understand the corrosiveness of the community, but they only see that the relationship is not healthy, is not cordial now that we have the the pandemic. So answering your question, what kind of things that has to be done? It has to be, first of all, the communication has to be rebuilt. It has to be based on trust and acceptance from the two sides. Because, even if the pendatang wants to be part of the community, but if the penduduk asli do not allowed, they don't allow the pendatang to be part of the social fabric. It's kind of difficult for them too. It's kind of difficult for the pendatang to participate, to be part of the the village. So, when we are talking about communication, of course, there is communication beyond verbal communication. When you actually meet people, you can see their body language, and sometimes there are places when the pendatang are not felt welcome because of the differences that I mentioned earlier. But I do agree with Pak Joko that we cannot paint the relationship between pendatang and penduduk asli in one broad stroke, that there are differences in terms of the communication between the pendatang and the penduduk asli, in different places. Thank you, Mbak Ita.
Very much. I would like you to briefly answer a question from Mbak Faida, because this is still related. So the in-group and out-group gap is widening towards the controversy ensues as village rejects nurse funeral in Central Java. So the dead body is rejected everywhere. What do you think about that?
I think it has a lot more to do. It has a lot more to do with education. People who understand what COVID is, people who understand how COVID is being transmitted will be less afraid of the burial of the people who passed away due to coronavirus. But a lot of things, if I can, Ita, I would like also to address the question of somebody that was directed to me privately, because it's related. I think it has a lot to do too with the way the government and other people about COVID-19. As you can see, there are a lot of words that are in English that a lot of people cannot understand. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of background noise. There's a lot of background noise. Okay, so the types of words that people use are in English. For example, we understand that the cause of COVID is droplet. And I've seen that in a lot of poster, people say penyebab corona adalah droplet. If you don't speak English, you must wonder what the heck is droplet. So that has to be translated not only in Bahasa Indonesia, but also in native and in different bahasa daerah. Yeah. So and the question here is that there is resistance from the local people, because well, I think first of all, the communication is biased against people who don't speak English. The communication is biased against people with lack of education. So, for example, I mentioned the word droplet, and then what do you call that? Physical distancing. work from home. Those are things that not people swab, rapid tests. Those are the words that people don't understand. So, of course, when people, you cannot expect a lot from people who do not understand, And I just read news about people in Manado. They went swimming. And when the Satpol PP came to tell them, look, we cannot have gathering. You have to split up. They said they believe that air laut is obat COVID. That actually by swimming in the ocean, that's how they prevent themselves from getting COVID. And then they said, well, we are from Manado. We are not the people who transmit the disease. The disease, the COVID-19, is transmitted in Manado by people from outside of Manado. So clearly, when we are talking about the communication, it's very important to use the local language, to translate the terms, the English terms that people up to now use to explain what COVID is, because only, I think everybody knows that only with the good explanation, good education about what COVID is, then we can try to reduce the gap between the educated and the uneducated. If people understand better what COVID is, they are less likely to be hostile to, let's say, people who died of COVID-19 or people who work in the hospital. There are cases when the ibu kos, the owner of the houses where the nurses or work, they told the nurses not to come back, not to go to their rented house, because a lot of people are afraid that they will be carriers, they will infect other people. Maika?
There are a lot more questions to you, but I'm afraid that I have to move to the next presenter now.
Yes.
The next question will go to Prof. Deng. I think I will invite Mas Hakim on the phone now.
Okay, thank you very much, Mbak Ita. Halo, Mbak Ita.
Yes.
I'm here.
Yes, please.
Hear
Go
me?
ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I have I have two questions. One goes to Bu Dewi, the second goes to the Pak Deng actually. But since you allow me to raise question to Prof Deng, I will ask Prof Deng about how do you see the impact of the pandemic COVID-19 on the global order, Prof. Deng? Because we read a lot discussion on newspaper that it is not just simply a virus. So there is something behind this, and that will bring a great impact on the economic and global order. How do you see about this issue, Prof. Deng?
Asaki, can you hear me?
Yes.
I think that there is the pandemic is this is another crisis in healthy issues. It's also this is a crisis to global relations. So what we see before, there's the global mobility is everywhere, and right now I think the most important will be the the issue of global relations. Probably we will see the nation state will come back, and you see in these times every uh, uh, single government they have adopt very strong measures against the um, pandemic spread. If you look at the European Union, you will see it seems sure the European Union they adopt try to very strong measures to help the country infected by the coronavirus most important very seriously. But you see the most effective one is nation state by the government in Italy, in France, in Germany, they adopt the strategies by their own and to against the coronavirus spread. And if you look at the trend that goes on, then it will be a very strong tensions between the European Union and each European countries. And probably this is also the case we should look at very carefully about what Dr. Mohadi has talked about the ASEAN countries. We will see the different countries have adopted different measures against the coronavirus spread. So if this this kind of emerging effects goes on, there will be a very strong tensions between the order of globalization and the nation state order. So how we make the balance between that? This is we should keep close, pay attention to that. The other one is not globalization's order by itself. It's about the productions. Before we see the China is seeing itself as the world factory. It produces everything, especially industrial goods for the world. And you will see currently in the US, in the European country, in many industrial advanced countries, they seems to adopt strategies. They want to some important things back to their own country to produce. If it is goes on, then probably we will see the so-called world factory in China then will be impasse. So probably they will move productions outside of China, and so the production outside of China, they said right now it's become a very very central term. They talk about the economics over the world. So I think if the China productions, the world factory become less and less important in the world, then it's quite an issue which we will talk about in the past coronavirus world order. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Deng, for your answer.
Right. We will move now to questions to Pak Muhadi. I will invite Anelo from Italy. You can either use your bahasa Indonesia, Anelo, if you want.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, my question about politics in Indonesia, because actually in all Asia study, in all Asia country, Indonesia is the bad country. I mean, they don't have really method for against the coronavirus. I mean, all the countries in Southeast Asia have a method. Israel, Cambodia, Myanmar, they have out of one method. Indonesia now.
Excuse me, your voice is on and off. Hello?
Okay.
Mbak Santi, maybe you can help.
Okay.
Good.
Okay. I just want to ask for all the professor. I think Indonesia has a really bad method for contrast coronavirus, because in all as a country, all country have adopt one method. Also, poor country like Vietnam. But if you see in Indonesia and the government just focus about the economy and not about the problem of the people. Indonesia have two problem. It's island, so I have a lot on the island, and it's not like Thailand. It's just you lock down Thailand, you all the border. you have three big islands, Bali, Java, Sumatra, Sulawesi. It's more difficult if you know that now to control the coronavirus. And my question is, if Jokowi don't change method, which way the possible of military problem, like coup d'etat for like 98. I mean, there ada kemungkinan army bisa ambil kekuatan karena kelemahan pemerintah.
So despite the fact that Indonesia is a very complex and very huge country, archipelagic country, Jokowi's administration response to this coronavirus threat is been questioned. And your real question is that it is possible. Is there any possibility for the military to go forward? Yeah.
Okay.
The time is yours, Pak Muhadi. Are you there?
As I mentioned before, that it does not make any difference whether it is about the